Section 9 of Lavender Lit 101. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Section 9 of Lavender Lit 101. Recollections of Oscar Wilde by Gide. Translated from the French by Percival Pollard. Those who came to know Wilde only in the latter years of his life can scarcely, in view of that feeble and infirm existence, have any conception of this wonderful personality. It was in 1891 that I first saw him. Wilde had at that time what Thackeray termed the most important of talents, success. His gestures, his look, were triumphant. So complete was his success that it seemed as if it had preceded him, and Wilde had nothing to do but follow it up. His books were talked about. Plays of his were on at several London theatres. He was rich, he was famous, he was beautiful. Happiness and honors were his. One likened him to an Asiatic Bacchus, or to a Roman emperor, or even to Apollo himself. What is certain is that he was radiant. When he came to Paris his name traveled from lip to lip. One told the most absurd anecdotes about him. Wilde was pictured as everlastingly smoking gold-tipped cigarettes and strolling about with a sunflower in his hand. For Wilde had always the gift of playing up to those who nowadays fashion fame, and he made for himself an amusing mask that covered his actual countenance. I heard him spoken of at Mallarmé's as of a brilliant causeur. A friend invited Wilde to dinner. There were 4 of us, but Wilde was the only one who talked. Wilde was not a causeur, he narrated. During the entire meal he hardly once ceased his narrating. He spoke slowly, gently, in a soft voice. He spoke admirable French, but as if he tapped a little for the words he was using. Hardly any accent at all, or just the faintest that he chose to adopt, giving the words often a quite novel and foreign air. The stories he told us that evening were confused and not of his best. Wilde was not sure of us and was testing us. Of his wisdom or his folly he gave only what he thought his listeners might like. To each he served a dish to suit the taste. Those who expected nothing of him received nothing, or the merest froth. And since all this was just amusement for him, many who think they know him only as an entertainer. As we left the restaurant on that occasion my friends went ahead. I followed with Wilde. "You listen with your eyes," he said to me rather abruptly. "That is why I tell you this story. When Narcissus died, the pool of his pleasure changed from a cup of sweet waters into a cup of salt tears, and the Oreads came weeping through the woodland that they might sing to the pool and give it comfort. And when they saw that the pool had changed from a cup of sweet waters into a cup of salt tears, they loosened the green tresses of their hair and cried to the pool, and said, 'We do not wonder that you should mourn in this manner for Narcissus, so beautiful was he.'" "But was Narcissus beautiful?" said the pool. "Who should know that better than you?" answered the Oreads. "Us did he ever pass by, but you he sought for, and would lie on your banks and look down at you, and in the mirror of your waters he would mirror his own beauty." And the pool answered, "But I loved Narcissus because, as he lay on my banks and looked down at me, in the mirror of his eyes I saw my own beauty mirrored." As I said, before others Wilde wore a mask, to deceive, to amuse, sometimes to anger. He never listened, and bothered little about any thought that was not his own. If he could not shine quite alone, he withdrew into the shadow. One found him there only when one was alone with him. But, so alone, he began, "What have you done since yesterday?" And as my life had then a very ordinary routine, what I told about it could hardly interest him at all. I rehearsed this very ordinary matter, and Wilde's frown showed. Really only that? Really nothing new. Then why tell it? You must see yourself that all that is very uninteresting. There are just two worlds. The one exists without one ever speaking of it. That is called the real world, for one does not need to speak of it to perceive its existence. The other is the world of art. One must talk of that, for without such talk it would not exist. There was once a man who was beloved in his village for the tales he told. Every morning he left the village, and when he returned at evening the villagers, who had tired themselves in labor all day long, assembled before him and said, "Tell us now what you saw today." He told them, "I saw a fawn in the wood piping a dance to little wood gods." "What else? Tell us," said the people. "As I came to the sea I saw on the waves 3 sirens combing their green locks with a golden comb." And the people loved him because he told them stories. One morning he left the village as usual, but as he reached the sea he saw 3 sirens on the waves combing with golden combs their green tresses. And as he fared on he saw in the wood a fawn piping before dancing wood nymphs. When he reached his village that evening and one asked him as of old, "Tell us, what have you seen?" he answered, "I have seen nothing." Wilde paused a little and let the story work into me. Then, "I do not like your lips. They are the lips of one who has never lied. I shall teach you to lie, that your lips may grow beautiful and curved as those of an antique mask. Do you know what is art and what is nature, and the difference between them? For after all, a flower is as beautiful as any work of art, so the difference between them is not merely beauty. Do you know the difference? The work of art is always unique. Nature, that creates nothing permanent, forever repeats itself, so that nothing of what she has created may be lost. There are many Narcissi, so each can live but one day. And every time that nature invents a new form, she repeats it. A sea monster in one sea knows that its image exists in some other sea. When God made a Nero, a Borgia, a Napoleon, he was only replacing their likes. We do not know those others, but what matter? What is important is that one succeeded. For God achieves man, and man achieves the work of art. That Wilde was convinced of his aesthetic mission was made clear to me more than once. The gospel disquieted the pagan Wilde. He did not forgive its miracles. Pagan miracles, those were works of art. Christianity robbed him of those. When Jesus returned to Nazareth, he said, Nazareth was so changed that he did not know the place. The Nazareth of his day had been full of misery and tears. This town laughed and sang. And as the Lord descended into the town, he saw flower-laden slaves hastening up the white steps of a marble house. He went into the house and saw in a jasper hall, reclining upon a marble couch, one in whose hair were twined red roses and whose lips were red with wine. And the Lord stepped behind him, touched his shoulder, and spoke to him. "Why do you spend your life like this?" The man turned around, knew him, and said, "I was a leper once, and you healed me. How else should I live?" And the Lord left the house and returned upon the street. And after a little while he saw one whose face and garments were painted, and whose feet were shod with pearls. And after her followed a youth, softly, slowly, like a hunter, and his coat was of 2 colors, and lust was in his eyes. But the face of the woman was as the lovely face of a goddess. And the Lord touched the youth's hand and said, "Why look you so upon this woman?" And the youth turned around, knew him, and said, "I was blind, and you restored my sight. Upon what else shall I look?" And the Lord approached the woman. "The way you go is the way of sin. Why do you go that way?" And the woman knew him, and said, "The way I go is a joyful way, and you forgave me my sins." Then the Lord's heart filled with sorrow, and he wished to depart from the town. As he came to the gates, a youth was sitting by the roadside, weeping. The Lord approached him, touched his hair, and said to him, "Why do you weep?" And the youth looked up, knew him, and said, "I was dead, and you waked me from the dead. What else should I do but weep?" "Shall I tell you a secret?" Wilde began another time. It was at Heredia's. He had taken me aside in the middle of the crowded salon and was confiding this to me. "Do you know why Christ did not love his mother?" He spoke quite softly into my ear, as if in shame. Then he made a slight pause, took me by the arm, and suddenly breaking into a loud laughter, "Because she was a virgin." One morning Wilde bade me read a review in which a somewhat unskillful critic had congratulated him upon the fact that he, quote, "gave form and vesture to his ideas by way of daintily invented stories," end quote. "They imagine," Wilde began, "that all ideas come naked into the world. They do not understand that I can think in no other way save in stories. The sculptor does not translate his thought into marble, he thinks in marble." Wilde believed in a sort of fate in art, and that ideas were stronger than men. "There are," he said, "two sorts of artists. These offer us answers. Those offer questions. One must know to which of these sorts one belongs, for he who asks is never he who answers. There are works of art that stand waiting, that one does not understand for a long time, for the reason that they offer answers to questions that one has not yet put, for often the question comes dreadfully long after the answer. And he said also, the soul comes old into the body, which must age to give her youth. Plato was the youth of Socrates." Then I did not see Wilde again for 3 years. A stubborn rumor that grew with his success as playwright ascribed extraordinary habits to Wilde, about which some people voiced their irritation smilingly, others not at all. It was added that Wilde made no secret of it, and spoke of it without embarrassment. Some said he spoke with bravado, some with cynicism, some with affectation. I was very much astonished. Nothing in the time I had known Wilde had led me to suspect this, but already his old friends were cautiously leaving him. Not yet did one quite disown him, but one no longer spoke of having known him. An unusual accident brought us together again. It was in January 1895. A fit of the blues had driven me to travel, seeking solitude rather than change. I hurried through Algiers to Bilda, left Bilda for Biskra. Leaving the hotel, my eyes fall, in weary curiosity, upon the black tablet that bears the names of the hotel guests. And next to my own I see Wilde's name. I was hungry for solitude, and I took the sponge and wiped my name out. Even before I reached the station I was in doubt as to whether I had not acted as a coward, and I had my trunk brought back and rewrote my name on the tablet. In the 3 years since last I had seen him, I do not count a very hasty encounter in Florence, Wilde had changed visibly. One felt less softness in his look, and there was something coarse in his laughter, something forced in his gaiety. At the same time he seemed more certain of pleasing, and less anxious to succeed. He was bolder, greater, more sure of himself. And curiously enough, he spoke no longer in parables. Not one single story did I hear from him the whole time. At first I voiced my wonder at finding him in Algiers. "I am running away from art," he replied. "I want to worship only the sun. Have you never noticed how the sun despises all thought? He always discourages thought. It flies to the shadows. Thought once dwelt in Egypt. The sun conquered Egypt. Long it lived in Greece. The sun conquered Greece, then Italy, then France. Today all thought is crowded out, driven into Norway and Russia, where the sun never comes. The sun is jealous of art. To worship the sun, that was to worship life. Wilde's lyric worship grew fierce and dreadful. A destiny determined him. He could not and would not escape it. He seemed to apply all his care, all his courage, to the task of exaggerating his fate and making it worse for himself. He went about his pleasure as one goes about one's duty. "It is my duty," he said, "to amuse myself frightfully." Nietzsche did not surprise me so much later because I had heard Wilde say, "Not happiness, anything but happiness, but pleasure, yes, pleasure, joy. One must always want what is most tragic." As he walked through the streets of Algiers, he was the center of a most strange crew. He chatted with each of these fellows. They delighted him, and he threw his money at their heads. "I hope," he said, "that I have thoroughly demoralized this town." I thought of Flaubert's reply when he had been asked what glory he held most worthy. "La gloire de démoralisateur." All this filled me with astonishment, wonder and dread. I was aware of his shattered condition, of the attacks and enmities aimed at him, and what dark disquiet he concealed under his abandonment of gaiety. One evening he appeared to have made up his mind to say absolutely nothing serious or sincere. His paradoxes irritated me, and I told him his plays, his books, were far from being as good as his talk. Why did he not write as well as he talked? "Yes," said Wilde, "the plays are not great. I think nothing of them. But if you only knew how amusing they are. Incidentally, most of them are the results of bets. So is Dorian Gray. I wrote that in a few days because one of my friends asserted I would never write a novel." He leaned towards me and added, "Do you wish to know the great drama of my life? I have given my genius to my life, to my work only my talent." Wilde spoke of returning to London. The Marquis of Q was abusing him and accusing him of flight. "But," I asked, "if you go to London, do you know what you are risking?" "That is something one should never know. My friends are funny. They advise caution." "Caution! How can I have that? That would mean my immediate return. I must go as far away as possible. And now I can go no further. Something must happen, something different." The next morning Wilde was on his way to London. The rest is well known. That something different was hard labor in prison. From prison Wilde came to France. In B, a remote little village near Dieppe, there settled a Sebastian Melmoth. That was he. Of his French friends I had been the last to see him. I wished to be the first to see him again. I arrived about midday without having announced myself in advance. Melmoth, whom friendship with T brought often to Dieppe, was not expected back that evening. He did not arrive until midnight. It was still nearly winter, cold and bitter. All day long I mooned about the deserted Strand, bored and moody. How could Wilde have chosen this B to live in? This boded no good. Night came and I went into the hotel, the only one in the place, where Melmoth too lodged. It was 11, and I had begun to despair of my waiting, when I heard wheels. Monsieur Melmoth had returned. He was numb with cold. On the way home he had lost his overcoat. A peacock's feather that his servant had brought him the day before may have given him a foreboding of ill luck. He expresses himself as fortunate to have got off with only the loss of his overcoat. He shakes with the cold, and the whole hotel is astir to make him a hot grog. He scarcely has a greeting for me. He does not wish to show his emotion before the others. and my own excited expectation quiets down as I find in Sebastian Melmoth so completely the Oscar Wilde, not the hard, strained, forceful Wilde of Algiers, but the soft, pliable Wilde of before the crisis. I feel myself set back not 2 years, but 4 or 5, the same arresting look, the same winning smile, the same voice. He lodged in 2 rooms, the best in the house, and had furnished them tastefully. Many books on the table, among which he showed me my Nourriture Terrestre, then but just out. On a high pedestal, in the shadow, a Gothic Madonna. We sat at a table by lamplight, and Wilde sipped his grog. Now, in the better light, I note how the skin of his face has roughened and coarsened, and his hands still more, those hands with their fingers still covered by the same rings, even the lapis lazuli in its pendant setting, to which he was so much attached. His teeth are horribly decayed. We chat. I speak of our last meeting in Algiers, and if he recalls my then foretelling his catastrophe. "You must have foreseen the danger into which you were plunging." "Of course! I knew a catastrophe would come, this one or that one. I expected it. It had to end like that. Think, going on was impossible. An end had to be. Prison has utterly changed me, and I have counted on that. D is terrible. He will not understand my not taking up my old life. He accuses the others of having changed me. But one can never take up the same life. My life is like a work of art. An artist never begins the same thing twice. My life before I was in prison was a success. Now it is quite ended." Wilde lit a cigarette. "The public is dreadful. It judges only by what one has done last. If I returned to Paris it would see only the condemned man. I shall not appear again until I have written a play." And then, abruptly, "Was I not quite right to come here? My friends wanted to order me south for rest, for at first I was quite unstrung. But I begged them to find me a quiet little village somewhere in northern France where I would see nobody, where there is some cold and hardly any sunshine. I have all that here. Everyone is very nice to me here, especially the clergyman. His little church is a great pleasure to me. Think, it is called the Church of Our Lady of Joy. Isn't that delightful? And now I am quite sure I shall never be able to leave B, for this very morning the clergyman has offered me a pew. And the customs officers, how bored such people are! I asked them if they had nothing to read, and now I am getting for them all the novels of the elder Dumas. I must stay here, eh? And the children here worship me. On the Queen's birthday I gave a feast to 40 school children. The whole school was there with the teacher. For the Queen's Day. Isn't that delightful? You know, I am very fond of the Queen. I always have her picture by me." And he showed me Nicholson's portrait of the Queen pinned to the wall. I arise to examine it. A small bookcase is underneath it. I look at the books. I wished to induce Wilde to talk more seriously. I sit him down again and ask him, somewhat timidly, if he has read the Recollections in a Morgue. He does not reply directly. These Russian writers are extraordinary. What makes their books so great is the pity they put into them. Formerly I adored Madame Bovary, but Flaubert would have no pity in his books, and the air in them is close. Pity is the open door through which a book can shine eternally. Do you know, it was pity that kept me from suicide. For the first 6 months I was so dreadfully unhappy that I longed to kill myself, but I saw the others. I saw their unhappiness. It was my pity for them that saved me. Oh, the wonder of pity! And once I did not know pity. He said this quite softly and without any exaltation. Do you know how wonderful pity is? I thanked God every night, yes, on my knees I thanked him, that he had made me acquainted with pity. For I entered prison with a heart of stone, and thought only of my own pleasure. But now my heart is quite broken. Pity has entered in. I know now that pity is the greatest and loveliest thing in the world. And that is why I can have nothing against those who condemned me, for without them I would not have experienced all this. D. writes me horrible letters. He writes that he does not understand me, does not understand my not taking arms against the whole world, since all have been abominable to me. No, he does not understand, cannot understand me. In every letter I tell him that our ways lie apart. His is the way of pleasure, mine is not. His is that of Alcibiades, mine that of St. Francis of Assisi. Do you know St. Francis? Will you do me a very great pleasure? Send me the best life of our Savior. I promised, and he went on. Yes, towards the last we had a splendid warden, a charming man. But for the first 6 months I was utterly, completely unhappy. The warden then was a horrible creature, a cruel Jew, without any imagination. I had to laugh at the absurdity of this rapidly uttered comment, and Wilde laughed too. Yes, he did not know what to invent for our torturing. You shall see how void of imagination the man was. You must know that in prison one has but an hour in the sunshine. That is, one marches around the yard in a circle, one after the other, and is forbidden to say a word. One is watched, and there are dreadful punishments if one is caught talking. The novices who are in prison for the first time can be distinguished by their inability to speak without moving their lips. For 10 weeks I had been there, and had not spoken a word to a soul. One evening, just as we are making our round, one behind the other, I suddenly hear my name spoken behind me. It was the prisoner behind me, who was saying, "Oscar Wilde, I pity you, for you are suffering more than me." I made the greatest efforts not to be observed, and said without turning around, "No, my friend, we all suffer alike." And on that day I did not think of suicide. In this way we often talked together. I knew his name and what he was in for. He was called P, and was a fine fellow. But I had not yet the trick of speaking with motionless lips, and one evening, "C-33," that was I, "C-33 and C-48, fall out." We left the rank, and the turnkey said, "You are to go before the warden." And as pity was already in my heart, I had fear only for him. I was even happy that I must suffer on his account. Well, the warden was simply a monster. He called P first. He wished to hear us separately, since the punishment for the one who has spoken first is twice as heavy as for the other. Usually the former gets a fortnight in the dark cell, the latter only a week. So the warden wanted to know which of us two had been the first. And of course P said he was. And when the warden interrogated me presently, of course I, too, said it had been I. That enraged the man so that his face went scarlet, for he could not understand such a thing. "But P declares also that he began. I don't understand." What do you say to that, mon cher? He could not understand. He was very much embarrassed. "But I have already given him 14 days. And then, "Very well, if this is the case, you simply both get 14 days. Splendid that, eh? The man simply had not an atom of imagination. Wilde was greatly amused. He laughed and then went on talking gaily. Naturally, after the 14 days, our desire to talk was all the keener. You know how sweet is the sensation of suffering for others. Gradually, one did not always parade in just the same sequence. Gradually I managed to talk with all of them. I knew the name of every single one, his story, and when he would be leaving prison. And to each I said, "The first thing you are to do when you come out is to go to the post office. There will be a letter there for you with money." There were some splendid fellows among them. Will you believe me if I tell you that already some 3 of my fellow prisoners have visited me here? Is that not wonderful? The unimaginative warden was succeeded by a very nice one. Now I could ask to read whatever I wished. I thought of the Greeks, and that they would please me. I asked for Sophocles, but he was not to my taste. Then I thought of the writers on religion. Those, too, failed to hold me. And suddenly I thought of Dante. Oh, Dante. I read Dante every day in the Italian, every page of him, but neither the Purgatory nor the Paradise was intended for me. But the Inferno! What else was I to do but adore it? Hell! Were we not dwelling in it? Hell, that was the prison. The same night he spoke to me of his dramatic scheme of a Pharaoh and of a spirited story on Judas. The following morning Wilde took me to a charming little house not far from the hotel that he had rented and was beginning to furnish. Here he meant to write his plays, first The Pharaoh, then An Achab and Isabella, the story of which he told marvelously. The carriage that is to drive me off is ready. Wilde gets in with me to accompany me a little distance. He speaks of my book, praises it cautiously. The carriage stops. Wilde gets out and says good-bye. Then abruptly, "Look here, mon cher, you must promise me something. The nourriture terrestre is good, very good. But, mon cher, promise me never to write I again. In art there is no first person." Back in Paris again, I told D. my news. He declared, "All that is quite ridiculous. Wilde is incapable of suffering boredom. I know him very well. He writes to me every day. I dare say he may finish his play first, but then he will come back to me. He never did anything great in solitude. He needs distractions. He wrote his best while with me. Look at his last letter." D. read it out to me. In it Wilde implored D. to let him finish his Pharaoh in peace. That then he would return to him. The letter closed with this glorious sentence, "And then I shall be king of life once more." Soon afterward Wilde returned to Paris. The play was and remained unwritten. When society wishes to destroy a man she knows what is needed, and she has methods more subtle than death. Wilde had for 2 years suffered too much and too passively. His will was broken. For the first few months he was still able to set up illusions for himself, but soon he gave up even those. It was an abdication. Nothing was left of his crushed life but the sorrowful memory of what he had once been. Some wit was still there. Occasionally he tested it, as if to try whether he was still capable of thought. But it was a crackling, unnatural, tortured wit. I only saw Wilde twice again. One evening on the boulevards, as I was walking with G., I heard myself called by name. I turn around. It was Wilde. How changed he was! "If I should reappear before I have written my play, the world will see in me only the convict," he had said. He had returned without his play, and when some doors closed against him he sought entry nowhere else. He turned vagabond. Friends often tried to save him. One tried to think what was to be done for him. One took him to Italy. Wilde soon escaped, slipped back. Of those who had remained longest faithful to him, some had several times told me that Wilde had disappeared. Hence I was, I admit, a trifle embarrassed to see him again like that, in that place. Wilde was sitting on the terrace of a café. He ordered 2 cocktails for myself and G. I sat down facing him so that my back was to those passing. Wilde noticed that and ascribed it to an absurd shame on my part, and not altogether, I regret to say, with injustice. "Oh," he said, "sit down here next to me," and pointed to a chair by his side. "I am so utterly alone now." Wilde was still quite well dressed, but his hat no longer was brilliant. His collar was still of the old cut, but not quite so immaculate, and the sleeves of his coat showed faint fringes. "When once I met Verlaine," he began with a touch of pride, "I did not blush at him. I was rich, joyous, famous, but I felt that it was an honor for me to be seen with Verlaine, even though he was drunk." Perhaps because he feared to bore G, he suddenly changed his tone, attempted to be witty, to jest. His talk became mere stumbling. As we arose, Wilde insisted upon paying. When I was bidding him farewell, he took me aside and said in a low and confused tone, "Listen, you must pay. I am quite without means." A few days later I saw him again, for the last time. Let me mention but one thing of those we talked of. He bewailed his inability to undertake his art once more. I reminded him of his promise that he had made to himself, not to return to Paris without a completed play. He interrupted me, laid his hand on mine, and looked at me quite sadly. One must ask nothing of one who has failed. Oscar Wilde died in a miserable little hotel in the Rue des Beaux-Arts. 7 persons followed to his funeral, and not all of these accompanied him to his last resting place. Flowers and wreaths lay on the coffin. Only one piece bore an inscription. It was from his landlord, and on it one read these words, "À mon locataire." End of section 9. Recollections of Oscar Wilde by Gide. Translated from the French by Percival Pollard.